Hello and welcome back to Macrobiology. Today we're going to start talking about communication, and communication, as we know, is important. It's something we talk about a lot, but the real question becomes how do other organisms communicate with each other? And it turns out that organisms of all type are communicating, from the very complex communication that primates, specifically humans, have, all the way down to bacteria that actually communicate with each other chemically. So today what we want to start talking about is, what does communication mean exactly? And that is that, oh sorry, this says a change in behavior must occur right there. The production of a signal by one organism that causes another organism to change its behavior in a way beneficial to one or both. Now the catch on that one is that it is beneficial in that it conveys some message and you have some sort of response. Now the catch also, the second catch, is that you have to have a change in behavior in one or more parties. So kind of a beneficial idea would be like, I tell you something here and you're gaining knowledge, and that's super exciting. The other thing might be that you're walking down the hall and someone is running and I say, hey, watch out, or you do the same for me. In that case, the benefit is that you've avoided any sort of injury. So there's got to be something that's exchanged. All right, so why would you do this? First of all, food. Food is a great reason to communicate. If you live in a community, and we've talked about group dynamics and group living, you want to share information about resources, because the more individuals that are getting resources, the more resources that can be had by the group. The other thing that you want to do is to look at threat behavior. And ritualized threat is one of those things we talked about when we talked about posturing. And we'll talk about this more as we start talking about the actual group dynamics, but there's kind of an attack communication, and sometimes that's actually a sincere attack, but most of the time it's going to be posturing within a group. And again, we'll talk about this more later. The other thing is defense. You want to let everyone around you know where your territorial boundaries are and when they have invaded them, and there's several ways to do that, and we'll talk about each of those as we go through this. Social organization is another thing. You want to tell everybody where you are in the group. And so what you're looking at is social status. And then probably the most important thing, but behind, actual eating, would be the reproduction component. And that's going to lead to our conversation about sexual selection. And there are all kinds of things that organisms do to let the females, and it's typically the females, know that they are the best choice. And we're going to spend a lot of time on this later on. Okay, so there are four main types of communication. There's auditory communication, and that is hearing, right? We're using sound for this. A lot of mating calls, warning calls, and then territorial statements are going to be auditory. Visual is really interesting because it gives you a lot of the traits that you see in nature that might be less beneficial to survival. Things like the peacock's tail, and we'll come back to that later on. This is something that is really effective over short distances, whereas auditory is over longer distances. It is very difficult to actually change the visual communication because you're looking at some sort of display usually, and that display may be coloration, it may be different structures, things like that, and those things don't change. Although if you're doing some sort of dance or movement, that is something that you can change, but by and large visual is going to be something that is actually inherent to the organism. Whereas auditory, first of all, sound carries very long distances. The howler monkey, for instance, can be heard over a mile away. In water, it's even more than that. So when you think about whales, you're talking about hundreds, maybe sometimes even thousands of miles. But it's easy to vary. All you have to do is modulate whatever your production system is. And it can be very, very complex. I mean, think about human speech. We convey a lot, not just in our word choice, but in the way we actually say it and our tone of voice. Now, you can combine auditory and visual and get very powerful types of communication. You can get very powerful messages that are very complex, yet very, how do I want to say this? They're very complex, but they're very simple in some ways, and very bold. Now, there are two more types that we want to talk about, and these are less for us as humans and more for other organisms. Chemical communication, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is very, very important. And the majority of organisms out there will actually communicate chemically, and we don't do that very well. We don't smell well compared to a lot of other organisms, but we do recognize smells. We can recognize things that smell good to us, and people that smell bad to us, people that smell attractive versus people that smell comforting, things like that. But this is going to be something that's going to be much more for other organisms. Then tactile is something we do, but you can see it a lot more in other, especially mammalian and bird societies. And actually, that's where you're going to see it is mammals and birds is going to be the tactile. But this is what helps you establish bonds. It's very limited because what you're doing is you're going to be grooming, or you're going to be, petting the other one, holding the other one close. And you've seen this in nature videos. But this is really important for establishing social bonds. You have to have this tactile communication. We'll talk about this later on. The chemical, and that's an immediate, it does not last, okay? But the chemical can last a very long time, but it's limited in how much information you can convey. And so each of these types of communication has some truly beneficial and real strength, and then it has weaknesses. And so most organisms will communicate in all of these ways or some of these ways as opposed to just one. Okay, so let's start out with chemical communication, and we'll address all of these as we go through this unit. But let's talk about chemical. And this is where we talk about communication by olfaction, that is the sense of smell, and gustation, which is the sense of taste. Now, we're not actually going to talk about microbes and how they communicate, but they also communicate chemically. But we're going to focus more on this idea of pheromones and things like that, of these, quote, higher order organisms. Okay, so this is the oldest type, and like I said, microbes do this, and so this is where that actually arises. It does not require any sort of complex receptive mechanisms like ears or eyes. All you have to do is have some chemical receptor, and that's it. And you can use it from, like I said, single cell to very complex organisms, although interestingly enough, we probably who have the most complex communication don't use this at all, really. Okay, so when you sense odors, smell is where you're having molecules of whatever it is that have diffused through air and or water, depending on where you live, and those are going to be picked up by some sensor in wherever that happens to be for you. And if you look at this picture, this just shows you how diffusion works, and you've talked about this in chemistry, and so it's exactly the same thing. We just happen to be talking about specific chemicals as opposed to general everything. Now, the problem with the chemical is that it's very difficult sometimes to tell where the source came from, and the odors may persist longer than the actual source intends them to. And so you may actually have an organism that has died or moved on from its territory, but the odor is still there. Okay. Now, one of the things that you can do to help localize where that is coming from is to move upstream, and as that odor gets more intense, you're getting closer to the source. Now, basically, there are two reasons that you do this. Well, three actually. One, to mark territories, and that's not on here, but it should be. You also use pheromones to attract mates, and then plants, the lovely smell of plants, is what attracts the pollinators. So it's a combination. That's actually a visual combination. So you have the smell, and then you also have the bright, attractive flowers. Okay, so pheromones are the ones that we're going to talk about the most. And these actually can be both taste and smell. It depends on where your sensory organs are, depending on what kind of organism you are. But there have been a lot of human studies that have been done. There have been tons of studies, just in general, animal studies, human studies. But in human studies, it's been very interesting because there's a gender association with smells. Men tend to like musk smells, more musky smells, and women tend to like sweet smells, which is interesting because it's the males of the species that tend to have the musk glands, and so that's the smell that they produce. And then you also tend to be attracted to people who smell different than you do. Those people will tend to smell more attractive because you have this system that allows you, in a way, to kind of smell genetic diversity. And so the people who are more or less, rather, like you genetically will often smell more attractive. Now, having said that, there are two familial smells that are very important. Babies can actually identify their own mother's milk by smell, and they prefer that because it's coming from their mother. And then family members, oftentimes there's a comforting smell that goes with family members, even though they're genetically similar. But remember, it's not an attractive smell, it's a comfort smell. And we'll come back to why family members would want to be comforted and bonded to the rest of their family. Okay, so one of the big things that you'll see a lot, and especially in water, is going to be alarm pheromones. Terrestrially, what you're going to use mostly is auditory and occasionally visual signals for alarms, but in water, this works really, really well. So what happens is there's some sort of danger, and then one organism will release the pheromone, and that sometimes it happens because they get eaten, right, or something like that, and then all of the other organisms in the group will respond to it. In this case, you've got these minnows, they're swimming around, they're having a good time. Right over here, the alarm pheromone is triggered, and they all cluster away from the concentration. They move downstream of the concentration gradient. And here are just some examples. Bees do this, and you can actually see that they do it for a couple of reasons. Killer bees, for instance, will actually release pheromones that will trigger attacks, right? And then ants, they're blind. They do everything chemically, and so they have alarm pheromones. They have chemicals that allow them to lay down trails. They have different chemicals for when they are foraging. So they're a chemical communication-based society. So, you know, everything they do is going to be chemical. But you can see these guys are responding to an alarm pheromone. And then these are tadpoles that are actually the same species. And this is the standard version of the tadpole, and this is the super predator defense version. So what happens is some of these tadpoles have a gene that will turn on in the presence of a pheromone that is released when one of these tadpoles gets eaten, typically by a dragonfly larva. That's their main predator. And when one of those gets eaten, some of them, the ones that have this gene, over the next couple of days, will actually turn into this, super defender. And so they're bigger, and they have these really, really big tails, and they're bright red. Now, you would think that bright red would attract predators, but because they have bigger tails and they're bigger, they're harder to eat, and they're faster. These guys are still small, and they're not as fast, but the catch is, and this is why both of these things are successful, because you would think that over time, these guys would be the ones who would end up dominating the gene pool, and you don't. You have some of both, and that's because these guys take less time to become frogs, because they don't have to put energy into becoming, super tadpoles. So they get out of the pond quicker, so a lot of them survive. These guys take longer to become frogs, but they're better at escaping. And so a lot of them survive, and so you end up with both phenotypes, which I think is kind of interesting. All right, now, sex pheromones, really important. These are going to advertise your status, your health, your gender, where you are in terms of mating. They're going to mark territory. You can see over here, here's like a little calling card. That's a doggy calling card. So this dog is figuring out all of the information about this dog. This cheetah is marking its territory by rubbing the scent gland onto this tree here, and that will do two things. It'll mark territory, but it'll also say their mating status. If it's a female, it'll say that she is ready to mate. If it's a male, it'll suggest that he is a good mate. Now, you can also, and this is what I was talking about with ants earlier, you can also use chemicals to lay down trails, and you can see here that you've got all of these little guys following this chemical trail that's been laid down by some researcher, and you can kind of see here where the trail actually is. These guys will just follow it in a circle forever. And then bees will actually have chemicals, but they also have their little waggle dance, and so I put them in here. But they'll also do, they'll release chemicals too to allow the other bees to follow. Now, chemoreceptors are the things that you need in order to pick up chemical information, and we have chemoreceptors too, right? We can smell things, we can taste things, and so we've got a fairly basic amount of these receptors, but other organisms have a whole lot more. And so these receptors will respond to a group of molecules. And so you don't have a receptor for each kind of molecule, but you have different receptors for different kinds, and different chemicals do different things to various receptors. And when you look at the human olfactory bulb, right? And so the olfactory bulb is going to be this right here. It goes to the brain. There are little nerves here, and then there are these chemoreceptors that come out here, right? And then you've got all the mucus that helps stick all that stuff. And mucus actually is really part of your defense system. That's pretty exciting. But here you've got the other portion of these cells, these nerve cells. Here's a fun thing. It's probably not actually that fun, but if you have a head injury and you get concussion, actually will do this, but if you have your head hit and your brain sloshes around in there too much, there's bone here, and this will actually shear off these nerves here. And so after a concussion, you find a lot of times that people lose their sense of smell, but fortunately these are cells that actually grow back. The rest of your brain cells do not, by the way, so just keep that in mind. But these do, and so over time your sense of smell comes back, but you'll lose it because they'll actually break these when you have some sort of head trauma. Alright, so when you look at a dog, dogs have huge amount of receptors, and they have something called a vomeronasal organ, and this really enhances their sense of smell. And so they have this that actually goes to the olfactory bulb that's in the brain, and so they're able to detect all kinds of smells that we are not, and they're amazing at it. And different dogs actually have varying degrees too. You have to keep in mind bloodhounds are going to be the most sensitive. They have those giant snouts. They have their little ears that will pick up dust and push it into their noses, so they can get better amounts of things into their nose. Now, snakes, on the other hand, they also have a vomeronasal organ, and we really don't. But theirs is going to be attached to their tongue. And so when you see the snake flicking out its tongue, all of these little molecules will land on the tongue, and they'll stick to it, and he'll bring it in, and then the vomeronasal organ will help pull those in, and then they'll be identified by the brain. Alright, and then taste is the other component of this. And smell and taste are very closely connected, but in the case of taste, you're going to have your chemoreceptors in your tongue, right? And so that's your taste buds, and all mammals, actually all vertebrates have some sort of tongue. When you're talking about reptiles, amphibians, and fish, it's usually a fixed tongue, and when you start talking about birds and mammals, you have a tongue that actually moves and helps move food around, but also you can stick it out and get more flavor there. And horses do something interesting, where they'll actually take in deep breaths through their nose and through their mouth, and that allows them to get sort of a boost of smell. Alright, and chemicals can actually be used for other things too. It's not just communication. The amazing thing that chemicals do, and the most complex chemicals that you find in nature, are actually going to be the venom and poisons and toxins that you find in organisms. And I just put this little guy up here. This is a slow loris. It's a primate, one of your cousins. And the slow loris is really interesting because of its diet. A lot of organisms will actually take in what are called secondary compounds, and these are toxins from something they eat. Then they will process it, and it'll become their own toxin, and they're defended by it. And so this little guy is slow, right? And sloth, slow, right? That kind of thing. They actually will lick their offspring, who are also very slow and sit in trees, and they are, susceptible to getting eaten because they don't go anywhere. But these guys, because of what they eat, have a toxic saliva, and they will actually cover their offspring in this toxic saliva, and so it protects them from getting eaten, because anybody that eats them will get sick and or die. Alright, and so venom is something we've talked about before. We've talked about chemical defense, right? And also for predators, it allows you to subdue and sometimes digest your prey. And this is that cone snail that we were actually talking about. That's one of the most toxic organisms in the world. Here's your jellyfish, little neurotoxin here. This, of course, is a giant, really frightening spider. And this is a man getting bit in the face by a snake who's also poisonous. The deal about this, though, is that these chemicals are very, very energy intensive. They're very expensive to make. And animals really don't like to use their toxins very much. They're only going to do it to get food or in an emergency situation as defense. And snakes, for instance, they don't always envenomate. Baby snakes, by the way, will always envenomate. But they don't always envenomate. And so you can actually get bit without getting venom, which is a nice thing for the snake, because then it gives you that first warning. Although if it has to strike more than one time, it will envenomate. Or if it's really, really threatened, it absolutely will. And the lesson here, of course, is don't stick your hands or face in any kind of animal, especially a poisonous one. But anyway, so we'll come back to this later on. This is expensive, and if we have time, we'll actually talk more about venom later on. All right, that is it for today in chemical communication, and if you have any questions about any of this, please ask during the next class, and I will see you next time.